Tuesday night. The kind of night people forget what they even had for dinner. I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of potato and bacon soup, my go-to comfort meal whenever early winter swept through Boise. The steam fogged up my glasses, and the steady clink of the wooden spoon against the pot echoed like a heartbeat in the house. A house I'd spent nearly 6 years turning into a home. Then Brandon, my husband, dropped a line as casually as reading a weather update. "Shelby's moving in, I think you should let her stay, long term." I froze, still holding the spoon, but my whole body locked in place. "What do you mean?" I asked, though it barely felt like my own voice. "I think it's time we give Shelby the house. She needs the space to study for the bar exam. This place just doesn't suit you anymore." I turned to look at him, not because I didn't hear him right, but because I needed to see his eyes, to confirm this wasn't some cruel joke. But Brendan's pale blue eyes held no guilt, no hesitation, just indifference, like he was suggesting we change the channel. I took a deep breath, my hand tightening on the cold granite countertop. "This house is mine, Brandon," I said, every word cutting through the thick air. "My grandmother left it to me before I ever met you." Brandon smirked, that half-smile that always made me feel small. "I know. But Shelby has a future. You just linger around here with your pots and pans. If she used the house, at least it'd mean something." I don't remember how long I stood there in silence. The soup still simmered, but all I could smell was betrayal. 37 years old, my name is Charlotte Hayes. This house, in the suburbs of Boise, Idaho, was the only thing my grandmother left me before cancer took her. I repainted every wall myself, redid the flooring on the entire first level, turned a weed-filled yard into a garden of tomatoes, mint, and lavender. I lived here, loved here, forgave too much in this home. And now, the man I married wanted to shove me aside so his 25-year-old sister, fresh out of school, could take my place. Someone who hadn't contributed a single dollar to our life. I let out a soft laugh, one I didn't recognize as mine. "Did you just call me useless?" I asked. Brandon crossed his arms, tilted his head like he was delivering a sermon. "I didn't say you're useless, I just think Shelby has drive. You've been stuck. You cook well, you keep the house clean, but you're not going anywhere." A chill ran down my spine, not from the open window, but from the man in front of me, the one who once promised to cherish me. Now he looked at me like a shadow, an obstacle to his sister's rise. I stared at him, searching for the face of the man who once knelt under candlelight and vowed I'd never feel alone in my own home. But that face was gone. What stood before me now was a stranger, cold and cruel. I let go of the counter. "No," I said. For the first time in years, I said no to my husband. Brandon frowned, but I didn't wait for a response. I set the spoon down, slowly turned off the stove. Outside, the wind whistled through the eaves, like it too was warning me. This storm wasn't just passing through. Brandon stood silent for 3 seconds, long enough to make me think he might reconsider, but he didn't. "You always ruin everything," he snapped, stepping closer, just a stride away. "Didn't you always say this house was about family? Shelby is family. She needs a place to start." I didn't answer, not because I had nothing to say, but because anything I said would be twisted. Brandon hated being challenged. Always had. He never yelled or slammed doors, but every word was a scalpel. "And another thing," he continued, voice flat and sharp, "don't forget, without me paying taxes, this place wouldn't stand long." I turned to leave the kitchen. I needed space. But then, a sharp crack tore through the silence. My cheek burned. The world tilted. I stumbled back, hit the chair, almost fell. My hand clutched the edge, trying to steady myself. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The wind still drifted through the cracked window, but it couldn't match the cold inside me. Brandon stood there, his hand still not fully lowered, his eyes wide, not with regret, but something emptier, something darker. No one screamed, no one cried. The kitchen remained quiet like nothing had changed. Only I stood there, flushed cheek, pounding heart, and something deep within me cracked. I turned without a word, walked upstairs. The door closed behind me with a soft click, final as a verdict. In the bathroom mirror, my face reflected a red mark stretching from cheekbone to ear. I touched it lightly, and it stung, not just my skin, but the trust that had just been torn in two. This wasn't the first time. Last year, after an argument about me skipping Brandon's cousin's wedding, the same cousin who once called me a gold-digging housewife, he gripped my wrist so hard it left bruises. He apologized. I forgave him. Then silence fell over everything. And in those silences, I lost pieces of myself, bit by bit. But this time, it wasn't a harsh word or a cold glare, not a clenched fist. This time, it was a slap. Clear. Intentional. No excuses. No ignoring it. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a pillow like it could hold me together. This room used to be my safest place. I painted the walls a soft beige because it reminded me of late afternoon sun. I chose the reading chair Brandon always said took up too much space. Nothing felt warm now. My eyes landed on our wedding photo. Me in a white dress, Brandon's arm around my shoulder beneath the pine trees in Coeur d'Alene. That day he kissed my forehead and said, "We'll walk this road together." Yes. But he never said that road would require me to keep walking backward. Until I disappeared. I stood up, opened the drawer, took out a towel-wrapped ice pack and pressed it to my cheek. Cold. But sobering. And in that cold, I realized one thing. If I didn't leave, that slap wouldn't be the last. And if I did nothing, my life would be handed over to someone named Shelby, a woman who had never once called to check on me, never planted a single flower on the porch, never wiped a drop of water off the tile I'd laid with my own hands. I asked myself, how many times had I yielded? Tried to understand him. And in return? I could hear Brandon's footsteps in the kitchen, the fridge opening, the sink running. As if nothing had happened. As if I didn't exist. I didn't know exactly what would come next, but I knew one thing for sure. I had hit my final limit. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. The sun hadn't yet risen over the eastern rooftops, but I was already sitting at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, eyes fixed on the blurred glass pane. Brandon entered minutes later, dressed in his usual navy work shirt, acting like the night before never existed. He poured himself coffee, whistled an old tune, then sat down like everything was just fine. "Can you get Shelby's room ready this afternoon?" he asked casually. "I called her. She's coming this weekend." I nodded. Just that. No arguing, no questions, no pushback. I wouldn't confront him anymore. I would disappear quietly. That afternoon, once Brandon left for work, I began the first step of my plan, opening a separate bank account. I chose a small branch 10 miles from home, where no one would recognize me. I only brought basic documents. "I need a personal savings account separate from our household finances," I told the young woman at the desk. She smiled, asked nothing. An hour later, I had a card, an online login, and the seed of freedom quietly blooming in my chest. That evening, while Brandon watched football, I opened my laptop and logged into the joint account we shared, one I had barely touched in 6 years. I quietly transferred $4,300. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to start my own path. I changed my email password, withdrew some cash, reset all security questions, ones only I knew the answers to. Step by step, I undid every invisible lock Brandon had ever placed on my life. In the days that followed, I began moving my things bit by bit. An old journal, a pair of earrings my mother gave me, my college photo album. I tucked them into a tote bag, slipped them into the trunk under a blanket. Just looked like gardening tools. I kept cleaning, cooking, smiling as Brandon rambled on about work or Shelby's arrival. "Saturday night we'll have a family dinner," he said over salad. "I'm inviting Susan from next door and Mike and his wife. Everyone loves Shelby." "Sounds great," I said, handing him another helping. No one suspects the woman pouring wine at dinner is preparing to leave it all behind. I timed everything while Brandon was at work or golfing. One afternoon I removed the painting above our bed, where I had hidden the deed. My name was the only one on it. I placed it into a plastic box and buried it beneath tools in the car trunk. Brandon never looked there. On Friday, I cleaned Shelby's room per Brandon's request. I stripped the bed, wiped the shelves, even placed a fake flower arrangement on the nightstand. Everything was perfect. Except for one thing. It wasn't my home anymore. That final night before I left, it rained. I sat in the living room, the warm light casting flickering shadows on the wall. Brandon was asleep. He hadn't noticed the swelling on my cheek had turned from red to deep purple. He hadn't asked if I was okay. To him, my silence meant I had come to my senses. I unlocked my phone and messaged the only person I still trusted. Maggie, my college best friend now living in Bend, Oregon. I need a place to stay for a few weeks. Can I come to you? She replied almost instantly. The guest room's always yours. Drive safe. And don't look back. I smiled, eyes stinging. Near midnight, I quietly packed everything I needed into the car trunk. A suitcase, a file box, a small pouch with jewelry and family photos, and an old leather notebook filled with wishes I once believed in. Before I left, I walked back to the kitchen and placed a short letter on the counter, where I knew Brandon would see it first thing in the morning. I didn't write much, just a few lines, not to explain, but to end. Brandon, I'm not a possession. No one gets to give or take what I inherited. Shelby doesn't need this house. You need to face the truth. I'm leaving. And this time, I'm not coming back. I signed it, Charlotte, with a steady hand. The door closed behind me without a sound. But I knew in that silence a chapter had locked behind me, and a new road, one I'd never dared to walk, had just opened. I got in the car. Rain tapped softly on the windshield. The road ahead was dark, but my heart felt lighter than ever. I left at 5:12 a.m. Boise was still blanketed in a soft fog, with only a few dim streetlights casting pale orange glows onto the wet pavement. The rain from the night before still streaked across the windshield, but I didn't turn on the wipers. I wanted to see everything, blurry or not. The old car rolled quietly out of the driveway like a fugitive, but I wasn't running. I was walking. Away from years of gentle-sounding manipulation and silent control. Away from the man who once promised to walk beside me, but turned out to be the first to shove me off the edge of loneliness. I glanced at the house in the rearview mirror. The porch where I used to hang Christmas lights each December. The steps where I'd planted lavender 2 years ago. The window where I taped birthday cards for Brandon as quiet reminders of love. Everything was still there, peaceful, almost painfully so. But it wasn't mine anymore. Because I had sold it. 3 days earlier I called my late grandmother's lawyer, Mr. Tiller, now nearly 80 but still sharp, and asked if I could legally sell the house without my husband's signature. His answer was clear. Absolutely. It's in your name, start to finish. I signed the contract online and added one condition. Vacant by Sunday. The buyers were a young couple from California. They'd included a handwritten letter saying they were expecting their first child and dreamed of a home with heart, one that had been cared for with love. I cried when I read that line. This morning, when I left Birchwood Street, I didn't just leave a letter for Brandon. I also left the deed transfer and a photocopy of the sale contract right next to the coffee maker. I knew he'd see it before he even brushed his teeth. I didn't write any blessing, no farewell, because I finally understood. For people who only know how to take, silence is the strongest statement. I drove west on Interstate 84, through sleepy rolling hills still tucked in mist. Morning sunlight filtered through the ridges, warming the hood of my car with a golden hue I hadn't felt inside my own home for years. On the passenger seat sat my handbag with that same leather notebook I'd carried since college. Inside were quick notes, Maggie's address, a bank appointment in Bend, and a list of women's resource centers I had saved long ago, but never had the courage to call. Maybe I'd be starting from nothing. Maybe I'd sleep on my best friend's couch, share a bathroom, and live on instant noodles for a while. But at least, it would be my life. No one pulling strings, no one trading my worth for their agenda. I turned on the radio. A dusty old country song played. I packed my bags and didn't look back / left the keys on the table and found my track. I didn't sing along, but I smiled. By now Brandon was probably awake. Maybe heading into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, reaching for his usual mug. Maybe, for the first few minutes, he wouldn't notice I was gone. But then, his eyes would land on the sheet of paper by the coffee maker. I imagined his face, confusion, disbelief, then anger. Or Brandon didn't like being one step behind. He'd always prided himself on controlling everything, from work to his wife's emotions. But this time I pulled the plug before he even realized it was loose. He'll call, text, maybe show up at Maggie's, maybe get a lawyer. But none of that matters now. Everything he thought he held over me, I've already freed myself from it. I signaled left, turning onto the small road leading into Bend. Daylight had fully arrived. Shops were opening. Pedestrians trickled in, slow and warm. I stopped at a local cafe for a break and ordered a latte. The first time in years I ordered something for myself, without asking, "What do you want?" When the barista handed me the drink, I thanked her and took a seat by the window. Outside, a young couple laughed, holding hands like the world belonged to just them. I didn't feel envious. I didn't feel regret. I just felt grateful. Grateful I left when I still had the strength to begin again. Brandon woke up later than usual. Saturdays were always his laziest, and today was no exception. He shuffled into the kitchen with messy hair and a caffeine-deprived scowl, but within seconds of spotting the counter, his grogginess vanished. The paper sat right next to the coffee machine. At first, he thought it was a shopping list, but then he recognized the familiar slanted handwriting. The very first line made the blood rush to his face. "Brandon, I am not a possession." His eyes scanned the rest quickly. By the time he reached the part saying the house had been sold and no one in your family was allowed inside, his hand clenched so tightly, the paper crumpled. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, storming to the bedroom and yanking open the closet. Empty. Next came the desk drawers, empty. Filing cabinet, empty. He rushed to the garage. Charlotte's car was gone. The gardening tool bin had been rummaged through. Everything familiar vanished. No more doubt. Charlotte had truly left. And this time, it wasn't after a fight. Visual? It was a departure, planned, deliberate, and final. Brandon didn't know what to do first. Call Charlotte? Call the police? Or call Shelby, who was already on her way, excited to begin a new chapter in her brother's house. About an hour later, Shelby stepped out of a silver SUV, suitcase in one hand and a box of muffins in the other. She smiled brightly, heels clicking on the porch steps that Charlotte had once scrubbed spotless. "Big bro, I'm here," she called out cheerfully, pushing the door open. But no one answered. She stepped in, instantly sensing something was off. The house felt hollow. Ooh, clean. No family photos. No smell of food. No sound of the TV Brandon usually left on playing sports. Just an eerie stillness like someone had left in a hurry. "Brandon?" she called again. Then Brandon appeared from the hallway, face flushed, hands shaking, phone in hand. He slammed the phone onto the table with enough force to crack the screen. "She's gone," he said, voice strained. "Charlotte?" "Left?" Shelby frowned. "What do you mean, gone where? On a trip? What happened?" Brandon handed her the letter. Shelby skimmed it, her expression paling with every line. "She sold the house?" "Legally," Brandon snapped, snatching the paper back. "I'm not on any of the documents, it's all in her name. She planned this whole thing, left me with nothing but this stupid note." Shelby looked around. The kitchen cabinets gleamed. The couch had been covered. The dining table was spotless. The beautiful home she thought she'd be living in was now nothing more than a shell. No warmth, no welcome. She stood frozen for a moment, then whispered, I didn't think she'd actually do it. I thought she was just upset." Brandon turned sharply. "Don't call her your sister. Don't defend the woman who just ripped everything away from me. This house. I maintained it, upgraded it, sweated through every summer in that backyard. I added value. All she did was garden and cook. Shelby swallowed hard. For the first time in years, her image of her big brother, reliable, put together, shattered. He didn't look strong. He looked like a man who had just lost everything he never truly appreciated. That afternoon, Brandon called the family lawyer, hoping to challenge the house transfer. The call lasted just 15 minutes. "Nothing we can do. Everything's legal. Signatures are valid," Brandon repeated in a flat tone. "She even removed my name from the home insurance policy 3 weeks ago." Shelby sat quietly on the couch, mind racing. When had Charlotte started planning all this? Why didn't she say anything? Was Shelby part of the reason she left? Outside, neighbors began noticing the unfamiliar car parked in front of what used to be Charlotte's house, now legally someone else's. A middle-aged couple walked up and rang the bell. When Brandon opened the door, they introduced themselves politely. "Hi, we're Tom and Erica, the new owners of this house. We're here for the scheduled 3 p.m. handover." Brandon stood frozen. Shelby's jaw dropped. Tom handed over a printed contract, everything signed and notarized via email. Erica added, "The agent said the house would be vacant. Seems there's been a mix-up?" Brandon said nothing. Shelby was the first to speak. "I'll leave right away. Sorry for the confusion." The door closed behind them with a heavy thud. Brandon collapsed onto the front steps. He had never imagined the day would come when the very woman he had dismissed would cut him out of the game entirely. Less than an hour after Brandon and Shelby quietly left the old house, the first signs of neighborhood curiosity began to stir. The corner house on Willow had always been a heart of the community, not because it was the biggest or most luxurious, but because Charlotte had tended its garden with care, mailed cards every holiday, and smiled at everyone who passed by. Now, no one stood on the porch. The door remained shut, and the shouting and crashing from that morning had neighbors whispering. Mrs. Karen, the widowed woman from the house next door, was the first to knock. She wore a wide-brimmed hat and carried a tray of cookies, the perfect cover for her curiosity. Shelby answered the door. "Oh, hello, dear," Mrs. Karen said, her eyes scanning the empty hallway behind Shelby. "I heard a commotion this morning. Is everything all right?" Shelby forced a smile. "Yes, just a bit of a misunderstanding. Charlotte had to go out of town for a few weeks." Even as the words left her mouth, they felt unnatural, and as expected, Mrs. Karen's gaze lingered on Shelby's face, wordless. She gently set the tray on the table and added, "Strange, Charlotte's never left without asking me to water the flowers, and those lavender beds she planted are starting to dry out." Before Shelby could respond, the doorbell rang again. This time it was Mr. Walter, the retired gentleman from across the street, standing beside his wife, Mrs. Lorraine. "Shelby, where's Charlotte?" Mr. Walter asked directly. "I saw a moving truck this morning. Is something going on?" Shelby opened her mouth to answer, but Brandon's voice came sharp from behind her. "Please leave, this is a private matter." His tone was harsher than necessary. Mrs. Lorraine tugged lightly on her husband's arm, her eyes fixed on Brandon like she was seeing through the years of polite, neighborly smiles for the first time. "Charlotte never shut us out like this," she said softly. "She's a good woman." Shelby stood alone in the silent kitchen after the neighbors had left one by one. She could feel the shift in the air. Brandon, once the respected man on the block, tall, successful, charming, now seemed to be unraveling piece by piece. That afternoon, Shelby opened her laptop and started researching property transfers. She didn't tell Brandon. She simply checked the name Charlotte had left in the buyer information. And then she read through the entire legal process, clean, transparent. Charlotte had done nothing wrong. In fact, she'd even left behind a maintenance stipend for the new homeowners as a final act of kindness. The more Shelby read, the heavier her heart became. She began to recall every small moment with Charlotte. Brief, but always gentle. And all the times she'd overheard Brandon snapping when Charlotte asked simple things, to change the curtains, buy another planter, or have her mother stay over for a few days. "She was always quiet," Shelby whispered. "But not because she was weak. It's because she'd taught herself how to survive." That night, while Brandon lay sprawled on the couch, holding his third beer, Shelby sat by the window, watching the streetlights glow. "Brandon?" she said, voice soft but firm. This isn't just about Charlotte leaving. This is about you making sure she had no reason to stay. Brandon snapped, don't start lecturing me, you don't understand. No, Shelby interrupted. I understand more than you think. I am the outsider, and if even I could see how badly you treated her, then you should know it wasn't a coincidence. Brandon slammed the beer can to the floor. She abandoned me. Left me out on the street. Took the damn house. The house was never yours, Shelby interrupted. It was Charlotte's. Her grandmother left it to her, and the only thing she did was take back what was already hers. After being hit by you, humiliated by you, treated like a live-in maid with a marriage certificate for years? For the first time that day, Brandon was silent. For a fleeting moment, Shelby felt a pang of sympathy for the man who had once been her childhood protector. But that feeling quickly vanished as she remembered the bruise on Charlotte's cheek. The one she used to believe came from slipping while mopping. The mask had fallen. And this time no one was willing to pick it up for Brandon. In Bend, Oregon, a small town tucked along the edge of the Cascade Mountains, I began the first chapter of a brand new life. The apartment I rented was a tiny studio on the second floor of an old red brick building, right above a used bookstore where the owner played jazz every Monday morning. No backyard, no lavender garden. But it had a window that looked out over tall pines and an old wooden desk just big enough for my laptop, a desk lamp, and a small cactus Maggie gave me when I arrived. You don't have to be strong right away, Maggie had said as I moved in. Just a little more steady every day. I wasn't pretending to be happy, I just didn't want to keep getting pulled back by the echoes, the cutting remarks, the cold glances, and the nights when the person beside me slept like I didn't exist. Every morning, I made coffee with my own hands. I didn't ask what anyone wanted. I didn't wait for anyone's approval. 3 weeks after leaving Boise, I walked into the local women's center to apply as a volunteer. A space that helped women who had experienced domestic violence, divorce, job loss, or who were simply trying to find themselves again. Gloria, the center's director, was a Black woman in her early 50s, eyes full of fire and a voice that pulled you in. She didn't ask too many questions when I said I had just left an unhealthy marriage. We need people who can listen without judging, she said. Do you think you can do that? I nodded. For the first time in many months, I felt useful just by being myself, not for what I could do for someone else. My days at the center taught me how to reconnect with the world without hiding parts of who I was. I met women who had fled into the night during a rainstorm, who had lost everything to financial control, who had been disowned by their own families just for refusing to stay silent. One afternoon, I sat beside Leshstein, Andrea, a woman 10 years younger than me, holding her newborn and too afraid to call home for fear they'd force her back to her ex-husband. I'm so stupid, aren't I? She asked, eyes red and swollen. I took her hand. No. You're braver than you think. And one day, you'll look back and realize, the decision you made to leave today, that's what saved you. At night, I returned to my small apartment, opened my laptop and began to write. Not for anyone else. Not to post or share. Just to remember who I was. The first pages were messy, fragments of thoughts, incomplete sentences, but gradually I began to write my life story in my own voice. Unedited, uninterrupted. One late afternoon I got a message from an unknown number. Charlotte, it's Shelby. I don't expect you to reply, but I need to say I'm sorry. For all the things I didn't see, didn't understand. I'm no longer staying in that house. I went back to my apartment. I'm trying to start over. Like you did. Thank you for going first. And for giving me a mirror to learn how to let go. I sat still in front of the screen. The message was short, but it carried something I never expected. Awakening. From someone who once stood firmly in Brandon's corner. I didn't reply right away, but I saved the number. And deep inside, I knew Shelby would be okay. That evening, I stepped out onto my balcony, tea in hand and a light blanket over my shoulders. The sunset stretched across the distant hills, tinting the sky a diluted honey orange. something inside me quieted. Not out of anger, not regret, just calm acceptance. I used to be the woman who arranged flowers on the porch in silence, who poured coffee each morning for her husband, and bowed her head because I believed silence meant peace. Now I know, peace should never come at the cost of losing yourself. And this new life, small and modest as it is mine. I chose it. My second month in Bend began on a chilly morning, walking through the town's Central Park with a coffee in one hand and an old notebook pressed against my chest. I had just finished sharing my story for the first time with a group of women at Haven Circle, a quiet but powerful nonprofit in the heart of town. Gloria, the one who believed in me from the very first day, had asked if I would share my journey with some of the new women joining the program. At first, I hesitated. I had never stood in front of anyone and named what had happened. The slap in the kitchen, the cold stares, the feeling of being an outsider in my own home. But when I sat in that circle and saw the worn yet hopeful eyes looking back at me, I knew I had to speak. I used to believe love meant silence, endurance, and unconditional sacrifice. I talked about the house in Boise, the kitchen I once considered my whole world, and the husband I had believed was my forever partner. I didn't sugarcoat it, and I didn't dramatize it either. I just told the truth, as if I needed to hear it again myself to remember how far I'd come. When I finished, the room was silent. Then, a middle-aged woman named Valerie, who had left her husband after 20 years of emotional abuse, stood up and hugged me. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saying what I never could." I cried, but those tears didn't carry shame, they carried relief. And gratitude. After that session, Gloria invited me to join a special project, creating new training materials for women re-entering the workforce after divorce or job loss. "You write with a voice that breathes," she said, "the kind that makes people see themselves in your words." I worked every afternoon in a corner by the center's window, where sunlight filtered through dusty glass and the scent of coffee drifted from the back kitchen. I wrote everything, from basic financial planning to identifying toxic relationship patterns. I titled it, Rebirth, Not Just Surviving but Living with Meaning. A month later, Gloria asked if I'd try teaching a class, not as a volunteer but as a full-fledged guide. I laughed, thinking she was joking. But during a staff meeting, my name appeared under provisional instructors. I stood up, hands slightly trembling, but heart full of fire. On my first day leading the group, I wore a wine-colored knit dress, the first thing I had bought with my own money after leaving Brandon. In front of me sat 14 women, ranging from their 20s to their 60s. Former teachers, office workers, single moms, and even one who had been homeless. But in their eyes, I saw myself. Before I knew the word courage. "I'm not here to teach you how to live," I began. "I'm here to say that I once wasn't living at all. I was just existing. And I don't want you to settle for that." From my small apartment, I rebuilt everything. I started each morning with yoga videos I found online. In the afternoons, I filled notebooks with lesson plans and ideas. At night, I answered emails from past students, women who had landed jobs, set boundaries, or found their voice. One young woman, Hannah, 26, nearly went back to her ex-husband after he promised he had changed. But she remembered something I had once said. "Don't confuse comfort with love. A cage lined in velvet is still a cage." She emailed, "You saved me from repeating the cycle my mother couldn't escape. I'm grateful not because you're perfect, but because you were real." I never thought of myself as a hero. I was just a woman who had stayed quiet too long, and now refused to let others carry that same weight alone. That evening, after a weekend session, Gloria gently touched my shoulder. "Charlotte," she said, "you're not just rewriting your life, you're rewriting hope, for women who thought theirs was gone." I turned and smiled, thinking to myself, if I hadn't left that day, would anyone have heard these words? Probably not. And that's why I never looked back. One April afternoon, while cleaning the top shelf to grab a summer blanket, I found the old box. A brown cardboard box, taped shut on all sides. The only thing I had brought from Boise that I hadn't opened in 6 months. I once thought I'd throw it out, But something in me had held on. Not out of regret, but because I needed a clear period at the end of that chapter. I laid the blanket on the hardwood floor, gently placed the box down, and peeled off the layers of tape. Inside were a few old photos. Brandon and me on our first camping trip, the backyard the summer I planted lavender, a handwritten letter Brandon gave me on our first anniversary, still stained with ink because I had cried while reading it. I found a small notebook where I used to jot down recipes and scattered dreams. Have my own garden. Teach a cooking class. Travel to Seattle alone. I picked up a chipped photo frame, our wedding picture, me in a simple white dress, smiling like everything ahead was sunlight. I looked closely into the eyes of the woman in that photo, the one who once thought love meant enduring. And then I folded the photo, placed it in a separate envelope, and marked it passed. The rest I wrapped up and took to the recycling bin. No tears, no regret. Because I'd learned that to truly live in the present, you have to cut ties with what once broke you. The following week, I received an email from the Oregon Women's Council. My piece, Rebirth Not Just Surviving, had circulated widely, and they invited me to speak at their annual conference on healing after divorce and emotional abuse. It took me nearly 3 hours to write a reply, part nerves, part emotion. I never imagined someone who once felt trapped in her own home, who left with nothing but a suitcase and a few $100s, could one day stand before hundreds to speak about the power of saying enough. I told Maggie the next night as we sat on the balcony with glasses of red wine. He laughed. Told you. None of us really knows how strong we are until we're the only one we can lean on. The night before the speech, I wore the wine-colored dress again. Not to prove anything, but because I simply liked how it fit the woman I had become. I clipped on my mother's old earrings, swiped on nude lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. That woman was still Charlotte, but no longer the Charlotte who waited by the window for an apology. I stepped onto the stage with my heart pounding, but the spotlight didn't scare me anymore. Looking out into the audience, I saw women of all ages, some newly divorced, some in custody battles, some who had started fresh with a small business after 15 years in a controlling marriage. Hi, my name is Charlotte Hayes, I began. I was slapped in the kitchen, where I cooked every day for the man I loved, and I thought, it must have been my fault, until one day I realized no one has the right to make me forget my worth just because I stayed silent. I didn't speak with bitterness, I spoke with the clarity of someone who had survived, healed, and rebuilt from the ground up. At the end of the session, a woman in her 60s came up, eyes brimming with tears. She whispered, "You gave me the courage to file for divorce, after 38 years. Thank you. You lived the years I thought I'd lost." I held her hand, overwhelmed. And I knew then, every crack in my life wasn't to break me, it was where the light got in. That night, back in my tiny apartment above the bookstore, I opened my laptop and typed the first line of my new book. My first chapter didn't start with love, it started with a slap. But every chapter after that I wrote myself with courage and inner light. I saved the file, made myself a mug of mint tea, and sat by the window, watching the stars shimmer. I don't know what tomorrow holds, but I know one thing for sure. I've closed the old chapter, and this time, no one else gets to write the rest of my story. Charlotte's story isn't just about escaping a controlling marriage. It's a living testament to the power of awakening and reclaiming self-worth. From someone who seemed to have lost everything, she rose, rebuilt from the rubble, and became a source of strength for hundreds. In real life, thousands of women silently endure toxic relationships. May this story remind them, walking away isn't failure. It's an act of courage to reclaim yourself. What do you think about Charlotte's decision? Would you do the same if you were in her shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to follow the channel for more powerful, real-life stories about family and life.